Okay, I just turned on the recording, and I'll just briefly say that I was sharing with the group that I feel that I am also exploring the Psalms together with you. So I think some of the Psalms will fit nicely into categories. Like we can say, oh, this is a Psalm of lament, or this is a Psalm of healing. And when we come into some of those Psalms, I think we'll be able to more clearly say, okay, and here's how you might use it in your own spiritual practice. Like this is one of the Psalms that Rashi recommends, for example, to say when you're praying for somebody's healing, and then maybe you might find it useful to use the Psalm in that way, right? Some of the Psalms are very familiar to us because we say them as part of our liturgy, or lines from them as part of our liturgy. And when that happens, we will also mention that and elevate that, raise that up, and ask, is the use in our liturgical setting of this psalm something that is consistent with what the meaning of the psalm is in its own context? If we're just going to take half a psalm and stick it into our liturgy, or verses from psalms and stick it into our liturgy, does it change our thinking about it when we read the whole psalm? So that will be part of what we talk about. So the theme of the psalm, our psalm's approach to liturgy. And as you can see in today's packet, I did bring some intertexts of the psalm. So when a psalm relates to other parts of the Torah or of the Bible, Tanakh, Hebrew scriptures, or relates to our Siddur, I will try to, as much as possible, bring those connections. And whether or not we directly discuss them, you'll have them in the packet to be able to think about. All right, does anyone have any questions or thoughts, or if you want to share what you're excited about this class or something like that?
Just looking over, just looking over the initial pages, I didn't realize, I read the first page and then I went to the second page and I went, oh, it's the same psalm, couched differently. Oh, it's the same psalm, the third. So that was really interesting and exciting to see the variations that people come up with in their translations.
Yeah, and I on that topic of, we're going to be looking at these Psalms in many different forms, many different translations. I will say that I didn't just bring Jewish translations. I also selected a few translations that are scholarly translations, both from Jewish and Christian scholars, and I picked a couple of sort of specific Christian, and when there are Psalms that have different cultural valence in our tradition and in Christian tradition, I will try, as I know about them, I will try to share them with you. Like I said, I don't consider myself an expert on this topic. I'm excited to be exploring it with you, and I'm hoping for myself that exploring Psalms in this way will help me to be more connected to the Psalms. All right, great. So I guess what I'd like to do in each of our classes is to read the Psalm out loud in Hebrew, because I think that hearing it in its original is useful, and also we might refer back to the Hebrew as we look at some of the different translations. When you listen to the Psalm being read in Hebrew, think about how it feels, what the grammatical structures are, what the sound of it is, and specifically with Psalms and biblical poetry in general. And like I said, I'm not an expert, but here's what I do know. Biblical poetry, what characterizes biblical poetry is parallelism and repetition. So you might get a phrase that means something, and then another phrase that means something very similar, but is sort of variations on a theme. We're going to see that a lot of times. And when for particular emphasis, it happens 3 times and you get 3 variations on that theme. So as we see in the first line, Ashrei Haish, happy is the man, happy the man. Asher lo halach ba'atzat rishaim, that's the first stick, the first phrase. Uvederech hataim lo amad, uvemoshav leitzim lo yashav. And so each of those three phrases has a very similar meaning, okay, but with some of the words changed. And one of the things that we're going to ask is, what is the effect of that in terms of our feeling, in terms of our understanding of the poem? And we're going to look at, you know, how many of these translators worked with that. So hang on, Henry and Esta, you're on the phone with somebody who can't get into our class.
Marsha's on the phone. She can't get in.
Okay, let's see.
Maybe I'll just listen on the phone.
Wait, let's see if you
The
can.
rabbi's looking.
If there's a quick fix.
I'm
Okay.
not good at this.
Oh, you're not.
No, I don't want to keep you from everything.
So Murray and Marsha registered
Wait.
using the MMJMHJ at Gmail. If they go
Yes.
into that email address, they should have just gotten an email that has the link for them.
Rabbi sent an email
Did you
to you.
hear? Go into your email.
Sorry about that.
We'll go into the email and just press the link.
Oh, I'll try it. But just go ahead, don't wait
Okay.
for anything.
Okay, bye.
All right. So I'll share my screen.
Sorry.
Nope, that's okay. I want everybody who wants to come to be able to get in. All right. All right, so I'm going to read first the psalm in Hebrew just so that we can hear it, and then we'll look at some of the translations. Ashrei haish asher lo halach be'atzat rishaim uvederech chataim lo amad uvmoshav leitzim lo yashav ki im betorat Adonai chefzo uvetorato yehge yomam v'layla v'haya ke'etz shatul al palge mayim asher piryo yitain be'ito ve'alehu lo yibol v'chol asher ya'aseh yatzliach Lochein harishaim ki im kamot asher tidfenu ruach al kein lo yakumu rishaim b'mishpat v'chataim b'adat tzadikim ki yodea Adonai derech tzadikim v'derech rishaim toved. All right, would somebody like to read our first translation? And you'll notice that I used Robert Alter just completed a full translation of the Tanakh. He's a rabbi. This is a Jewish translation of the Tanakh. Robert Alter is an amazing scholar, but in his process of translating the whole Tanakh, he did release several volumes in advance. For example, this book of Psalms, which is just the book of Psalms and his commentary on it. But you can also get his full Tanakh, which just came out a couple years ago. It's a 3-volume set. While I haven't spent a lot of time reading his translation, I think it is a fresh and new approach to understand the biblical language. And you can see from the tabs that I have taken Robert Alter's English translation, and I've given you the Hebrew in the same in his breakup, which I think I'm going to continue to do because I find it very clear and consistent, his approach. But it isn't the only way to show the Hebrew, right? I could just show the Hebrew as a paragraph, which is the way that it is contained in many. If you like open a Hebrew Sefer Tehillim, you're not going to get it divided out like this. You're probably going to get it just in a chunk, in a paragraph. All right.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
just as an aside, for those who don't know or may not know, Robert Alt is a graduate of a product of Temple Israel in Albany.
Oh, I didn't know that.
He's from Albany, and that's where he trained in his younger years.
All right. So a local person, which that's cool. Yeah. All right, cool. So would somebody like to read his translation, which is the first one? Yeah, Henry, go ahead.
Happy the man who has not walked in the wicked's counsel, nor in the way of offenders has stood, nor in the session of scoffers has sat. But the Lord's teaching is his desire, and his teaching he murmurs day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by streams of water.
Oop, that's a typo, should be streams.
Okay, streams of water that bears its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. And in all he does, he prospers. Not so the wicked, but like chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore, the wicked will not stand up in judgment, nor offenders in the band of the righteous. For the Lord embraces the way of the righteous, and the way of the wicked is lost.
All right, so before we keep going, does anyone have any thoughts on just how it feels to read this psalm, or what the meaning of the psalm is, or how you're feeling about it? Yeah, Kathy.
Because you commented on repetition, what stood out to me was how the first stanza, he uses the verbs walked and then stood and then sat and then day and night and then like a tree bearing fruit and a leaf. So he brings the imagery, repeating the imagery. I don't understand Hebrew enough. I'm sure it sounds even better in the Hebrew, but that I noticed.
Nice. So there is a progression here in the first line of walked and stood and sat. And one of the questions that I had in reading this is, first of all, do all the translators, are they all like tuned in to the way that that's a progression? And we're going to look at that as we look through the translations. And then one question I have is, which is worse? Like, is this an escalation or is it a de-escalation? Like, which is worse, to walk with the wicked or to stand with the offenders or to sit with the scoffers? You know, like walking, standing, or sitting, like which is the worst offense? Yeah, Gary.
My reaction to it was more like stages of life: walk, stand, sit, and it seemed to me that the whole poem sort of takes you through younger years, middle years, old age, and then the judgment or something like that.
Nice.
Oh, yeah.
One way to think about it is, as you go through your life, if as a young person you walked in the wicked's counsel, by the time you're an old person, you will be habituated to sitting with the scoffers. So there's like an aspect of habituation that is hinted at in these three verbs as they converge. Yeah, and I do think that Gary's insight here in thinking about walking, standing, and sitting as also referring to stages of life is a really valuable, good one. Let's see. Henry, you had something you wanted to say when we went with Kathy's comment first.
It long since passed.
Okay. Okay. Great. So the first psalm, which is in some sense an introduction to the whole book, and in some sense not an introduction to the whole book, right? That is to say, Psalm 1 is one of these psalms that doesn't fit neatly into some of these categories I was talking about before. And some scholars have suggested that Psalm 1 was actually written specifically to be an introduction to the book of Psalms. And so there's an underlying, I think, idea here, right? That what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to be studying Torah all day, right? Day and night, murmuring the Torah. And if you do that, you'll be righteous and you won't wither and you're going to bear good fruit, you know, like good stuff will happen to you if you're doing that righteous activity. But if you are standing in the way of offenders or sitting in the session of scoffers, then you're going to be like the chaff that the wind drives away. And I think as an introduction to the book, part of what it's saying is these psalms, the psalms that you're now going to read as part of this book, they qualify you as, you know, as Torat Adonai. They qualify, you might think that these are psalms written by King David or written by whoever, like psalmists. You might think that these psalms are human works, and they are, but they qualify you. If you're murmuring these psalms, you're in the righteous category. Happy is the person who spends their time studying psalms. I think there's a sense of that in the way that this psalm introduces the text. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we look at some of the intertexts. So let's read some of the other translations and see what jumps out to us. So, okay. Kathy, can you read the Richard Levy, the left side?
Yes. Ashrei Ha'ish, happy is the human who has not walked in the counsel of the wicked, excuse me, and in the path of sinners has not stood, and in the chamber of cheats has not sat down, finding delight instead in the Torah of Adonai, reflecting on that Torah in daytime and the dark. Such a human is like a tree planted by a stream of water, offering its fruit when the time is ripe, leafy at all times, never withering. Whatever it produces lasts. Not like this are the wicked. They are like chaff instead, scattered by the wind. Therefore, the wicked cannot withstand judgment, nor can sinners stand in a community of the just. For Adonai penetrates the path of the just, but the path of the wicked will disappear.
So what do you notice that's different, or what jumps out to you about this translation? Yeah, Gary.
Is the Torah with a capital T what is meant by the Hebrew?
That's a great question. That's a great question. Yeah, so you can see that Alter translated the word Torah literally as teaching. And we know that the word Torah means teaching. We actually very commonly use another form of that verb to mean teacher, moreh or morah, like our teachers in the religious school go by, you know, Morat Zipporah, and right, morah means teacher. So Torah, which is from the same Hebrew root, literally means the teaching. Sometimes it's the teaching with a capital T, sometimes Torah with a capital T. But here, Robert Alter, by putting teaching with a lowercase t, right? It's sort of the broad understanding of, oh, like the teaching of God can be something very broad. It's not necessarily speaking about this specific book. Whereas Rabbi Richard Levy really says, nope, this psalm is talking specifically about the Torah with a capital T, meaning the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, right? Hebrew scriptures. And I do think that there's a reasonable debate to be had about what is the intent of the psalm. Also, sort of going back to my comment about, is this psalm written specifically to introduce this this book of psalms, or is it its own psalm in its own right? I think that definitely reflects on whether you translate it as the Torah or just teaching. All right, good. What else jumps out about this translation? This translation is clearly trying to be egalitarian, right? It's a non-gendered approach. Happy is the human, not happy is the man. And it does make some tense shifts in order to not refer to God with a pronoun. So, right, like in this one, you can see that the Hebrew says uvatorato, meaning God's teaching, and the translation here says and his teaching, and this says and on that Torah. Okay, right, as in, right, that the word that there is trying to specify which Torah we're talking about without using a gendered pronoun to refer to God. Right? I appreciate that, because I also try very hard not to refer to God with gendered pronouns. But on the other hand, I think that if you're trying to do a translation of Hebrew and Hebrew refers to God with gendered pronouns, right, choosing not to do so, at least, like, it's a conscious choice. Right, also the person, Ashrei Ha'ish, ish means human being, no question, but it also literally means man. Okay, and so by expanding it, happy is the human, the picture that you get is a much more expansive or broad version. Like, it could be anyone, any person, not just a man, which I do think is the intent of the psalmist, but it is not what it says. You can see that Alan Roth tries to chart a kind of medium path about that. Like, blessed is the one who does not walk in the counsel of the ungodly, but he will be like a tree planted by the channel. So, like, it's not, Alan Ross is not as committed to rewriting the psalm to be gender neutral. All right, any other thoughts? What do you think of chamber of cheats as opposed to session of scoffers?
I think poetically it's better.
Yeah, I like it too. I think it's very interesting, right? That is to say, it's clear that the translators are trying to write poetry, not just to translate word for word, but to give a beautiful rendition of the psalm, right? To do something that works also in English. And so I think that as we note the ways in which the translators are using alliteration in English to try to also emphasize things that they feel like should be emphasized in the psalm, I think that that's really beautiful. The last thing I wanted to point out here is whatever it produces lasts, right? Is how he's understanding the chol asher yaseh yatzliach. Okay, everything that that person does will succeed, which Alter translated, and in all he does, he prospers. Okay, so this is saying whatever the person produces, who is the righteous person, that will last. And I think thinking about the concept of lasting as succeeding or as prospering is an interesting thought, right? Like, what does it mean for somebody's Torah to be successful? What does it mean for somebody's life to be successful? Here, the translator has weighed in on what it means to succeed, and it means for it to be lasting. But that isn't necessarily the only understanding of what success is. But I do think it's a beautiful thought. That is to say, and I don't think it's inconsistent, right? Leafy at all times, never withering, right? Whose leaf does not wither. That is very consistent with the idea of lasting. So I don't think it's inconsistent with the text of the psalm, but it isn't the only possible way to understand it. Yeah, Gary.
It made me think about children. And probably because it talks about the fruit of the tree. And I don't know if children can be yatzliach. That's at least what I was thinking about.
Yeah, I don't think that you're wrong. Like, I do think that there is a hope here in that righteousness will beget more righteousness, that through your righteous deeds, you bring more righteousness into the world, both through your own progeny and through your other actions. Yeah. So the last thing I wanted to point out here is the path of the wicked will disappear. And before we had the way of the wicked is lost. Oh, the end of this psalm says wickedness itself is going to disappear. Wickedness itself is going to disappear. And I think we should keep watching how the different translators translate that. All right, who would like to read Alan P. Ross? Alan Ross is a professor of divinity at Beeson Divinity School, and also has taught at Trinity Episcopal School of Ministry and the Dallas Theological Seminary. And so this is a Christian author, but with a specifically scholarly approach as opposed to a spiritual approach. We're going to look at a Christian spiritual author also.
Where is it?
I don't think that's printed.
Rabbi, what page is it?
It's the
Same
one on the right side of page 2.
Oh,
Got it.
All right, go ahead, Esther.
Oh. Blessed is the one who does not walk in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of the scorners, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He will be like a tree planted by channels of water that brings forth its fruit in its season, whose leaf does not wither. Not so are the ungodly, but they are like the chaff which the wind drives away. Therefore, The ungodly will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly will perish.
All right, so I'm not, like I said, I'm not an expert, and I can't tell you whether some of the differences here are because of his Christian background. I don't know, but I do think that it's really interesting that he translates the wicked as ungodly, which our first two translations were Jewish translations, and they did not do it that way. So I don't know whether it's because of his Christian background, but I do, it is a question that I have. And again, I don't want to over analyze his Christian background, but he translates the word Torah as law, not as teaching. And I do think that that's consistent with a Christian approach to what they imagine the Torah is, okay, as law, right? Now, sometimes you can have Torah translated as instruction, okay? And it does mean that, and it means that in the sense of law, right? To instruct is to lay down the law. But we generally translate as teaching, not as law. And I wonder if the Jewish scholars are avoiding the overly commandedness, the instruction, the legal ramifications or connection there of whose delight is in the law of the Lord. Interesting. Yeah, Gary.
I didn't realize that this was a Christian translation, and it makes me think about line 5 there, where he says the judgment, as opposed to judgment.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So, al kain lo yakumu rishaim bamishpat. Okay. Therefore, the wicked will not stand up in judgment. But to translate it as in the judgment is not completely inconsistent. And so there's a real question there about, okay, is that also because of his Christian background? Yeah, Henry.
So what struck me is that when we read that, and when Esther read that, we always talk about the 613 laws of Moses or of the Bible. And to me, that's what seems to be what he's reflecting on, that the Bible contains laws.
Right. Yeah. And the word Torah can mean instruction. I wouldn't go so far as law, although, again, when we talk about Torah, we often mean like the laws that are contained within it.
Right, but I think in this Christian point of view, maybe that's just more, that's an important factor.
Yeah. Lori.
Yes, the answer is yes. It's written that way on purpose. So translated that way on purpose to show you need to walk the path of God so that you will go to heaven instead of perishing in hell. It's written that way on purpose.
Right.
Yeah.
All these
for
words
sure.
are ungodly and
Yeah.
And
yes.
Right. Yeah. Also interesting to translate the word ashrei, which means happiness, as blessed. Right. We have a word that means blessed, and it isn't ashrei, right? That word means happy. So it is an interesting aspect.
He chooses to use the term Lord over God, or what we tend to now move away from.
Yeah, so Lord there is my understanding is that that's a technical translation of the Tetragrammaton, right? A Yud Hey Vav Hey, which like, and we will see different ways of doing it, but writing Adonai also means the Lord, okay? Right, Adonai means the Lord, and here, right, Alter also uses the word Lord, right?
Mm.
That is to say, if the Hebrew was Elohim or El, then translating it as God would be would be a better translation. But when we see the formal name of God, the Tetragrammaton, that kind of means was, is, will be, like that's a non-existent form of the verb to exist, to be. That often gets translated as Lord. And here, all the capitals tell you that it's Lord, specifically meaning that name for God. Great. So let's move on to page 3.
I got one more question about
Oh yeah, go ahead.
that one. He doesn't translate the last bit of verse 3
Yeah,
at all.
I agree with you, and I'm wondering if I just accidentally missed it in my typing up. Which is possible,
Not that
or
important.
it's possible that my guess is that I just missed it.
Okay.
I have to go back and look. Yeah, good catch. All right, so this one is interesting because this is a James Hamilton Jr. published, and he's Christian also, published his own translation of Psalms. And so he wrote this book, which is the Evangelical Biblical Theological Commentary. Okay, so his background is evangelical Christian. He is doing something that he believes is a theological approach to the Psalms. And the way that he structures his book is also in comparative translation. He takes the Christian Standard Bible, which I've given you also on the left, and his own translation on the right. And so he's also trying to do what I'm doing. He's saying, look, here's what you might get if you open the Christian Standard Bible, but here's what it really means, according to me. And I mean, and he's a scholar, but his approach is not, it's not an academic work in the way that the one I just showed you was. This is, he's a professor of biblical theology at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and his approach is explicitly theological. All right, so, and he's an evangelical Christian, so I think we'll find his translations interesting in that respect. So the Christian Standard Bible: how happy is the one who does not walk in the advice of the wicked, or stand in the pathway with sinners, or sit in the company of mockers. Instead, his delight is in the Lord's instruction, and there's instruction with a capital I, right, referring to Torah, and he meditates on it day and night. He is like a tree planted beside flowing streams that bears its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. Whatever he does prospers. Therefore, the wicked are not like this. Instead, they are like the chaff that the wind blows away. Therefore, the wicked will not stand up in judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked leads to ruin. Not the way of the wicked will itself disappear, but the way of the wicked leads to ruin. Which I think, I mean, when I saw that translation in the Christian Standard Bible, I was like, oh yeah, I think that that's definitely a possible understanding of this psalm. But it's interesting that up till this point, right, none of our translations saw it that way. And the Hebrew says the way of the wicked will vanish, will disappear, will be lost, right? So it's the way of the wickedness itself. But this is saying, no, it's not that wickedness itself is going to disappear, but that if you go the way of the wicked, you're going to end up leading to ruin, which I think it's interesting. Okay, and so then his translation, blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, and in the way of the sinners he does not stand, and in the seat of the scoffers he does not sit. That is a much closer reading of that phrase in Hebrew, and you can even tell by the way that he put the words, the order of the words. That is, he's trying to put the order of the words more similarly to the way that it shows up in the Hebrew text, which I think is cool. Okay, but in the Torah of Yahweh is his delight, and on his Torah he meditates day and night. He will be like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in its season, and whose leaf does not wither. And in everything that he does, he prospers. Not so the wicked, but they are like the chaff which the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not rise in the judgment again, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For Yahweh knows the way of the righteous, while the way of the wicked will perish. So in some sense, this translation actually is much closer to some of the Jewish translations that we looked at the beginning, in its sort of sensitivity to the Hebrew itself. I get the sense that that Hamilton is here translating from the original Hebrew. Although often Christian translators will look at the Hebrew and also at the Greek Septuagint. And certainly the King James version of the Bible, which is the first English translation, or the first popularized English translation of the Hebrew Bible into English. That version, the scholars who worked on that definitely were looking at both the Hebrew and the Greek versions. And I do also think that they looked at the Latin Vulgate. So there are different versions of the Torah, and the Greek version, the Septuagint, does disagree in some respects with the Torah's version of the. I mean, it's every translation is an interpretation. So if you're looking at the Greek version, you're looking already at a translation, an interpretation of the Torah. So what do you guys think of this, of Hamilton's sort of approach? All right. All right, we're gonna just look at one more translation, and then I'd like to do a little bit on the intertexts before we close. This translation, back to a Jewish translation. This is an Orthodox Jewish translation of the Torah, of Psalms. It's comes from the yeshiva world, like a ultra-Orthodox sort of approach. Fortunate is the man who did not go in the counsel of the wicked, nor stood in the path of sinners, nor sat in the company of scoffers. Rather, his desire is in the Torah of God, and in his Torah he meditates day and night. He shall be as a tree planted beside streams of water, which, being well irrigated, brings forth its fruit in its season, and whose leaves do not wilt, and whatever he does shall prosper. Not so the wicked, who are rather like chaff driven by the wind. The wicked shall therefore not endure in judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For God pays attention to and blesses the path of the righteous, whereas the path of the wicked shall perish.
He changes things up.
He does. He does. Also, and I think I tried to show this by the way that I wrote it. He isn't as interested in the line breaks. He is much more interested, like each sentence is its own line, right? So he's imagining the Hebrew where each sentence is its own thought, you know, and so, right, he's not in some sense trying to write a poem as much as he is giving a translation of the Hebrew. Yeah, okay, cool. All right, so I do want to look at some of these intertexts. So first, oh yeah, Henry.
You had asked about Hamilton's translation, and I just want to say that when you read the Hamilton translation, it is much more contemporary poetry than everything else. It really reads as a poem that I would be able to read and say, oh, this is a new poem. This is very interesting, as opposed to some of the other pieces.
Yeah, and I think he's trying for that. He wants the Psalms to be something that people are reading.
Yeah.
And he wants to create a translation that is theologically consistent with what he believes in his evangelical approach to, you know, but like, or also his contemporary approach to it says, no, like, I'm not going to translate Torah as law or instruction or even teaching. I'm going to put Torah because the psalmist said Torah, right? And I do think that that's consistent with Protestant Christians in this country who are trying in some sense to say, look, Jesus read these psalms and Jesus would have thought of it as the Torah.
And he says Torah of Yahweh. It's not, it's like
right. It's not
another.
Right. That's right. Right. And I think that's significant in his approach. Yeah, Gary.
There was one other thing about Rabbi Marcus that struck me, and it's only because I'm trying to learn something about Hebrew tenses. And his translation clearly puts the first verse in the past, second verse in the present, and the third verse in the future. And
nice.
That's the others don't do that. The others are a little bit more ambiguous.
Yeah. Right. So the Hebrew, Ashrei ha'ish asher lo halach. Halach is definitely sort of a completed verb, like past tense. Here it's translated as who has not walked, which is sort of past continuing.
But Marcus's translation did not go.
Right. In that, it's completely in the past tense.
Right.
And then ki im b'torat Adonai chefzo u'b'torato yehegeh. Yehegeh is an incomplete verb. Mm-hmm. So incomplete action, which is here translated by Alter as ongoing, continuing, murmurs, but which could be understood in future tense. Yehegeh is an incomplete action. Now, incomplete actions could be continuing actions or they could be future actions. So here it's also translated as in present tense. In the Torah, he meditates. And then the next one, v'haya, that is in biblical grammar, when you put the vi on the haya, so haya is a past tense verb. But when you put the vav on it in biblical grammar, that also refers to incomplete action. It's an imperfect. Imperfect is the technical grammatical term for incomplete action. So v'haya means, and it will be, and he shall be in the future. And again, like kol asher ya'aseh is absolutely a future tense. So so I think that is sort of an accurate progression of the Hebrew. I think Alter would say all three of these verses are referring to sort of continuing action. You know, and we know that the first verse is referring to continuing action because of the second and third verses. All right. Okay, so we don't have a lot of time, but let me just quickly say about these intertextual texts. So the phrase "ke'etz shatul al palge mayim" or "ke'etz shatul al mayim" is a phrase that occurs another place in the Torah, in the Tanakh, in Jeremiah 17, where it's clear that it's not Ashrei, happy, but it's Baruch, right? Baruch Asher Yiftach Badonai V'Hayadonai Yiftacho. He shall be like a tree planted by waters, sending forth its roots by a stream. It does not sense the coming of heat. Its leaves are ever fresh. It has no care in a year of drought. It does not cease to yield fruit. So you can see how that image is either the psalmist was aware of Jeremiah's verse, or Jeremiah was aware of the psalmist's verse. I don't know which came first, but you can see how they're both playing with the same image and doing so both with this idea of the righteous or the trust, right? And you can see that Jeremiah's version of it is slightly different from the psalmist's version. So that's cool. And then I wanted to point out that, and this goes back to the point that I made at the very beginning about whether this psalm was written as an introduction to the book of Psalms. So the one reason why you might think that is Sefer Tehillim is the first book of our Ketuvim, of our writings. So when we divide out the Torah, when we divide out the Hebrew scriptures into Torah, 5 books of Moses, Nevi'im, prophets, and Ketuvim, writings, what we find is that Moses's Torah concludes with the instruction to always be thinking about the Torah, right? Moses says right at the end of the book of Devarim, you got to keep thinking about Torah, right? And then the book of prophets begins, and in the very first chapter of the book of prophets from the book of Judges, Joshua says, and the book of the Torah, let not this book of teaching, right, Sefer HaTorah, cease from your lips, but recite it day and night, so that you may observe faithfully all that is written on it. So the very first chapter of Sefer Nevi'im, right, of the book of the prophets, right, Sefer Yoshua, which is the first chapter of the section of the Bible called prophets, also uses this phrase that is also used in the very first chapter of the very first book of the section of our Torah that's called writings. So both in Nevi'im and Ketuvim, this phrase "Uvatorato yegeh yomam v'layla" is used, and so it is definitely clear that the use of that phrase is self-referential, or is clearly referring in some sense, Gary, to the Torah itself, the 5 books of Moses, because why else would it start both the Nevi'im section of the Tanakh and the Ketuvim section of the Tanakh without a clear understanding that it's referring to the Torah, the 5 books of Moses itself? I think that I'm very convinced by that argument. Like, if you said to me, here's why I can definitively prove to you that the first psalm was written as an introduction to this book and not as its own psalm, right? This is the most convincing piece of evidence to me. And I think it's kind of really cool that both Joshua and the first chapter of the book of Psalms both uses this kind of language. And of course, we also use it every day in our evening service, when right before we say the Shema, when we say, we will speak of your laws, rejoicing in your words. We shall meditate on them day and night. And that meditate on them day and night is the same exact phrase. We change it to plural there, in our evening service. Okay, we didn't get to the commentaries, but I hope that we really enjoyed this first session, and I look forward to joining with you again next week, assuming that that we don't have a baby between now and then. Otherwise, I'll see you in January.
Sounds good.
All right.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good week.
You too.